The sun blazed mercilessly over the New Mexico territory as Theodora Norton clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma to her chest, sweat trickling down her face as she stared at the swollen river before her. June 1879 had brought unexpected heavy rains, transforming the usually placid Pecos River into a roaring beast that stood between her and freedom. Behind her lay the remnants of her old life, a burning homestead and the fresh grave of her husband, murdered by land grabbers who wanted their small ranch. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also hope in the form of her sister's home in Santa Fe. Theodora took a deep breath and stepped into the rushing waters, determination overriding fear as her daughter whimpered against her. Theodora had been walking for 3 days, the worn leather of her boots offering little protection against the rocky terrain. Her provisions had dwindled to almost nothing, and the summer heat had become increasingly unbearable. The river crossing hadn't been part of her original plan, but the band of men who had killed her husband had picked up her trail the previous evening, forcing her to abandon the main road. "Hush now, Emma," she whispered as the cold water rushed around her ankles. "We're going to be just fine." The weight of her carpetbag pulled at her left arm while her right held Emma securely. Each step forward became increasingly difficult as the current pushed against her skirts, dragging them downstream like anchors. The water, initially at her ankles, now surged around her knees as she moved toward the center of the river. "Just a little farther," she encouraged herself, focusing on the opposite bank where the promise of safety beckoned. A fallen branch drifted past, nudging her leg with unexpected force. Theodora stumbled, regaining her balance just as Emma began to wail, sensing her mother's fear. "It's all right, sweet girl," she soothed, though her voice trembled. The water reached her waist now, and each step required tremendous effort. Her sodden skirts threatened to pull her under, and the carpetbag felt like it weighed 100 pounds. But she couldn't let go. It contained all they had left in the world. Midway across, the riverbed suddenly dropped away beneath her feet. Theodora gasped as the water rose to her chest in an instant. Emma's cries grew more frantic as water splashed against her tiny body. Panic surged through Theodora as she struggled to keep both herself and her baby above the waterline. "Help!" she screamed, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the river. "Somebody help us!" Her foot caught on something underwater, a rock or submerged branch, and she pitched forward. In that horrifying moment, Theodora made the only choice she could. She released the carpetbag to use both arms to hold Emma overhead. The current immediately claimed their remaining possessions, sweeping them downstream in seconds. Water rushed over her head as she fought to remain upright. Her lungs burned and her soaked clothing dragged her downward. Just as she felt her strength failing, powerful hands gripped her shoulders. "I've got you, madam," a deep voice called over the roar of the water. "Hold on to the baby." Through water-blurred vision, Theodora saw a tall figure beside her. A cowboy, his hat somehow still secured to his head, had waded into the raging river. With seemingly effortless strength, he pulled her toward him, supporting her weight as they moved toward the shore. "Keep your feet moving if you can," he instructed firmly but gently. "We're almost there." His steady presence gave her renewed strength, and together they battled the current. Emma continued to wail, but she was safely above the water, clutched tightly in her mother's arms. When they finally reached the riverbank, Theodora collapsed onto the sandy ground, gasping for breath. The cowboy knelt beside her, concern etched on his sun-bronzed face. "Are you all right, madam? Is your little one hurt?" Theodora looked up at her rescuer properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with kind blue eyes that contrasted sharply with his weather-beaten face. His dark brown hair curled damply at his temples where it had escaped from beneath his hat. "We're alive, thanks to you," she managed between ragged breaths. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Preston Holloway," he replied, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy despite their waterlogged state. "Most folks just call me Prees. I'm Theodora Norton. This is my daughter, Emma." She adjusted her hold on the baby, who had calmed somewhat but still hiccuped with distress. Preston's eyes softened as he looked at the child. That's quite a brave little lady you've got there. He glanced back toward the river. If you don't mind my asking, what on earth possessed you to try crossing the Pecos during flood season? And alone with a baby, no less. The question brought reality crashing back. Theodora's momentary relief vanished as she remembered the danger that had driven her into the river in the first place. There are men following me, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. They killed my husband 3 days ago, burned our home. Her voice broke. I had nowhere to go but forward. Preston's expression darkened. Land disputes, Theodora nodded, not surprised he'd guessed correctly. Such conflicts were all too common in the territories. The Simmons gang, she elaborated. They wanted our water rights. William refused to sell. Recognition flashed in Preston's eyes. I've heard of them, bad business. He surveyed the landscape with new vigilance. How far behind you are they? Half a day, maybe less now. Preston stood, offering his hand to help her up. Then we'd best not linger. My camp's not far from here, just over that ridge. You and your little one need dry clothes and warm food. Theodora hesitated only briefly before accepting his hand. With no possessions and nowhere to go, she had little choice but to trust this stranger. Yet something in his steady gaze reassured her. My bag, she said suddenly, looking downstream. Everything we had left was in it. Preston nodded sympathetically. The rivers claimed it now, I'm afraid, but don't worry about that just yet. First, let's get you both somewhere safe. He helped her up the embankment, supporting her elbow when her sodden skirts made climbing difficult. At the top, he stopped and removed his duster coat, which had somehow remained relatively dry as it had been tied to his saddle. Here, he said, wrapping it around her shoulders. It's not much, but it'll help keep the wind off until we reach camp. Theodora accepted the gesture gratefully, pulling the coat close around herself and Emma. It smelled of leather, tobacco, and horses, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. My horse is just through those trees, Preston explained, pointing to a small grove nearby. Can you manage a little further? Theodora nodded resolutely. After all she had endured these past days, a short walk was nothing. Lead the way, Mr. Holloway. Please, he corrected with a small smile. After pulling someone from a river, I reckon we can dispense with formalities. For the first time in days, Theodora felt a tiny flicker of hope. As they walked toward the trees, she silently thanked whatever providence had placed this cowboy at the river at the exact moment she needed help most. Preston's horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding, nickered softly as they approached. The animal stood patiently, reins loosely tied to a low branch. This is Buck, Preston introduced, patting the horse's neck. Best partner a man could ask for out here. He untied the horse and gathered the reins. I'll walk and lead him. You and the little one can ride. Before Theodora could protest, he had formed a stirrup with his hands and was helping her mount. Once seated in the saddle, she adjusted Emma in her arms, grateful to be off her feet. It's about 20 minutes to my camp, Preston explained, starting to lead Buck at a gentle pace. I've been working as a scout for some settlers heading to Santa Fe, but I rode ahead to check the river conditions. Good thing I did. Theodora looked down at the top of Preston's head as he walked beside the horse. Were you planning to cross today? He shook his head. No, madam, the Pecos is too high for wagons right now. I was just assessing how long we might be delayed. He glanced up at her. The settlers are camped about 5 miles back, waiting for my report. This information both relieved and concerned Theodora. On one hand, there were more people nearby, safety in numbers. On the other, she worried about bringing her troubles to innocent settlers. These men following me, she said hesitantly, they're dangerous. I wouldn't want to endanger your group. Preston's expression remained calm. The Simmons gang is 3, maybe 4 men. We've got 15 able-bodied men in our party, all armed, plus they don't know you've joined us. He offered a reassuring smile. Sometimes the best hiding place is among others. They crested a small hill and Preston pointed to a sheltered area between 2 rock formations. That's my camp there. It was a simple setup, a small tent, a neatly arranged fire pit with a coffee pot hanging nearby, and Preston's bedroll laid out under a small lean-to fashioned from a tarp. Everything was organized with the precision of a man accustomed to life on the trail. Preston helped Theodora dismount, then efficiently set about rekindling the fire that had burned down to embers during his absence. Within minutes, flames licked at fresh kindling, and the promise of warmth made Theodora realize how cold she'd become in her wet clothing. "I don't have much in the way of women's things," Preston said apologetically, "but I've got a spare shirt and some trousers that might work with a belt cinched tight. Not proper, I know, but they're dry." "Proper stopped mattering when they killed my husband," Theodora replied more sharply than she intended. Immediately, she regretted her tone. "I'm sorry, that was unkind. You've been nothing but helpful." Preston waved away her apology as he rummaged through his saddlebags. "No need to apologize for speaking truth. Grief's a hard trail to ride." He pulled out a clean flannel shirt and canvas pants, offering them to her. "For the little one, I'm afraid I don't have much. Maybe this kerchief could work as a temporary wrap." Theodora accepted the clothing, touched by his consideration. "I can fashion something from your shirt for Emma. It's more than enough." Preston nodded, then gestured to the tent. "You can change in there. I'll keep watch and get some coffee brewing." Inside the small tent, Theodora carefully stripped off her sodden dress and petticoats. The shirt Preston had provided was soft from many washings and smelled faintly of soap. She pulled it on, rolling up the sleeves several times before tackling the trousers. They were indeed too large, but with the belt cinched to its smallest setting, they stayed up well enough. Using her wet dress, she wrung out as much water as possible before tearing strips from the driest portions to create a makeshift swaddling for Emma. The baby fussed at being disturbed but settled once wrapped in the dry fabric. When Theodora emerged from the tent, Preston was crouched by the fire, stirring something in a small pot. He glanced up, his expression carefully neutral as he took in her transformed appearance. "Feel better?" he asked, returning his attention to what appeared to be a simple stew. "Much," she admitted, sitting on a nearby log with Emma in her arms. "Thank you for the clothes." "They suit you," he said simply, then immediately looked slightly embarrassed. "That is, they look practical enough for the situation." A small smile touched Theodora's lips at his discomfort. "They'll certainly be easier to travel in than skirts." Preston nodded, seeming relieved by her practical response. He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. "It's strong, I'm afraid. Trail coffee usually is." The warmth of the cup felt heavenly against her palms. "Strong is exactly what I need right now." As she sipped the bitter coffee, Preston served up 2 bowls of stew. It was a simple concoction of beans, jerky, and what appeared to be wild onions, but to Theodora's empty stomach, it smelled like a feast. "When did you last eat?" Preston asked, noticing the way she eyed the food. "Yesterday morning," she admitted. "I had some hardtack and dried beef, but it was in my bag." Preston's brow furrowed. "Eat slowly then. Too much too fast will make you sick." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds being the crackling fire and Emma's occasional cooing. Despite his advice, Theodora found herself scraping the bottom of her bowl all too soon. "What's your plan?" Preston finally asked, setting his empty bowl aside. "You mentioned Santa Fe earlier." Theodora nodded. "My sister lives there with her husband. He's a blacksmith. They've always said we could come if things got bad." She looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep in her arms. "I never thought I'd need to take them up on it." "Santa Fe's where our group is headed," Preston said. "You're welcome to travel with us, safety in numbers, like I said." The offer was so casually made, yet it represented a lifeline Theodora hadn't dared hope for. "I wouldn't want to impose, it's no imposition," Preston interrupted gently. "The trail to Santa Fe is no place for a lone woman and child, especially with those men on your tail." His expression softened. "Besides, several of the families have young children. Your little Emma might enjoy the company, and I suspect the women would welcome another female face." Hope and wariness warred within Theodora. Her recent experiences had taught her harsh lessons about trust, yet survival instinct told her Preston's offer was her best option. "When would we join them?" she asked, tacitly accepting. "Tomorrow morning. I need to report back about the river conditions anyway." He stood, gathering their empty bowls. "We'll leave at first light. The main camp is about 2 hours' ride from here." As the afternoon faded into evening, they settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Preston tended to Buck, checked his weapons, and secured the perimeter of their small camp while Theodora cared for Emma. The baby was fussy from the day's ordeal but eventually settled, her tiny hand clutching a finger of the cowboy's shirt that now served as her blanket. When darkness fell completely, Preston built up the fire and unrolled his bedding. "You and Emma take the tent," he said firmly. "I'm used to sleeping under the stars." Theodora didn't argue. The events of the day had left her bone weary, and the prospect of even a canvas shelter seemed luxurious compared to her previous nights on the run. "Thank you, Preston," she said simply. "For everything." He tipped his hat slightly. "Get some rest, Mrs. Norton. Tomorrow will come early." Inside the tent, Theodora settled Emma beside her on the surprisingly comfortable bedroll. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive as her mind replayed the day's events. The terror of the river, the miraculous appearance of Preston, the hope of safe passage to Santa Fe, it all seemed somehow unreal. Outside, she could hear Preston moving quietly around the camp, the occasional snap of the fire and the distant call of a coyote. Strange how the presence of a man she'd known less than a day could bring such a sense of security. With that comforting thought, Theodora finally drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had since William's death. Morning arrived with the first golden rays of sunlight filtering through the canvas. For a disorienting moment, Theodora forgot where she was, reaching instinctively for William before reality crashed back. Emma stirred beside her, making the small mewling sounds that preceded full wakefulness. The smell of coffee and something cooking drew Theodora outside. Preston was already up, tending a pan of what appeared to be cornmeal mush over the fire. "Morning," he greeted, his voice low. "Hope you slept well." Theodora nodded, adjusting Emma on her hip. "Better than I have in days." "Good." He gestured to the pot. "Breakfast isn't fancy, but it'll keep you going." As they ate, Preston outlined the day ahead. "We'll break camp in about an hour, ride to meet the wagon train. The river's too high to cross safely, so I'll be recommending we follow it north about 10 miles to a narrower crossing I know." "Will that delay your group significantly?" Theodora asked, concerned about imposing. Preston shrugged. "A day or two, but better delayed than drowned." His eyes flickered briefly to Emma, and Theodora knew he was thinking of their river rescue. After breakfast, they efficiently packed up the camp. Preston showed remarkable skill in breaking down the tent and securing everything to Buck's saddle. Within the hour, as promised, they were ready to depart. This time, Preston fashioned a simple sling from a spare blanket so Theodora could carry Emma securely against her chest, leaving her hands free. He helped her mount Buck, then swung up behind her. "Forgive the impropriety," he said, his voice close to her ear as he reached around her for the reins, "but it's the safest way to travel with the little one." Theodora nodded, acutely aware of his solid presence at her back. Under different circumstances, such proximity to a man she barely knew would have been scandalous. Now it merely felt secure. They rode at a steady pace through the rugged terrain. Preston was a skilled horseman, guiding Buck confidently around obstacles and finding the easiest path forward. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or share brief observations about the land, but mostly they traveled in comfortable silence. "Tell me about your husband," Preston said after they had been riding for nearly an hour. "If you don't mind speaking of him, that is." The question surprised Theodora. Most people avoided mentioning the recently deceased, as if speaking of them might somehow cause pain. "William was a dreamer," she said after a moment's reflection. "He saw possibilities where others saw barren land. We came west from Illinois 3 years ago after his parents died and left him a small inheritance. He wanted to build something of our own. Sounds like a good man. He was." Theodora felt the familiar ache of loss, but speaking of William felt right somehow. "Not very practical sometimes, but kind and hardworking. He was so excited when Emma was born, had all these plans for her future." Preston remained respectfully quiet, allowing her to continue at her own pace. The trouble started about 6 months ago, she went on. A man named Silas Simmons arrived with his brothers, claiming they had rights to the water that ran through our property. William checked with the land office our deed was clear, but Simmons wouldn't listen to reason. Men like that rarely do, Preston commented. The threats started small, missing livestock, damaged fences. Then 3 days ago they came while William was repairing our well. I was inside with Emma. Her voice faltered. I heard the shots. When I looked out, William was on the ground and they were pouring coal oil on our barn. Preston's arm tightened briefly around her waist, a gesture of comfort that required no words. I grabbed what I could, took Emma, and ran out the back way into the woods. They burned everything. I circled back the next morning after they'd gone. I buried William under the oak tree where we used to have Sunday picnics. The memory of that lonely burial, digging the grave with their garden shovel while Emma slept nearby, threatened to overwhelm her. You're stronger than you know, Theodora, Preston said quietly. Many would have given up after such tragedy, she shook her head. Not with Emma depending on me. They crested a hill and Preston reined Buck to a stop. Below them, spread across a small valley, was the wagon train, 8 covered wagons arranged in a loose circle with people moving about between them. There they are, Preston said, our traveling companions for the journey ahead. As they approached the camp, their arrival was quickly noticed. A man with a gray beard stepped forward, raising his hand in greeting. Holloway was beginning to think the river swept you away. Preston dismounted, then helped Theodora down. Nearly did, but not me, he replied, turning to introduce her. Mrs. Theodora Norton and her daughter Emma. They'll be joining us to Santa Fe. The bearded man's eyebrows rose slightly at Theodora's attire, but he offered a polite nod. Samuel Winslow, wagon master for this motley crew. Welcome, madam. Other members of the group began to gather, curious about the newcomer. Preston quietly explained that Theodora had lost her husband and home without mentioning the specific circumstances. The response was immediate and heartwarming. You'll stay with us, dear, declared a matronly woman who introduced herself as Martha Kinsey. My husband and I have plenty of room in our wagon, and we've raised 5 children ourselves. Another woman, younger and heavily pregnant, stepped forward with a bundle of fabric. I have some dresses that might fit you, though they might need taking in. Within minutes, Theodora found herself surrounded by the women of the train, each offering what they could: clothing, blankets for Emma, even a wooden teething ring carved by one of the men. Their kindness was overwhelming after days of fear and isolation. Preston stood back, watching with a small smile as Theodora was absorbed into the group. When Samuel Winslow approached him, he finally turned away. The river's too high at the usual crossing, he reported. We'll need to head north to the Narrows. Winslow nodded. Expected as much with the rains we've had. How long will it take? 2 days to reach it, another to get everyone across safely. And the woman? Winslow asked quietly. There's more to her story, isn't there? Preston's expression grew serious. The Simmons gang killed her husband, burned them out. They may be tracking her. Winslow's bushy eyebrows drew together. Nasty bunch, those Simmons boys. How far behind? Can't say for certain. A day, maybe less. The wagon master stroked his beard thoughtfully. We've got enough men and guns to discourage most trouble. He glanced toward Theodora, who was now holding another woman's toddler while the woman examined Emma. She seems like good folks. She is, Preston confirmed. Just had a streak of bad luck. Haven't we all out here? Winslow clapped Preston on the shoulder. Get yourself some fresh coffee. We'll head out in an hour. As Preston moved toward the main campfire, he found his gaze continually drawn back to Theodora. Something about her quiet strength in the face of overwhelming tragedy resonated with him. He'd seen too many broken by the harsh realities of frontier life, yet she remained unbowed. It was admirable. And if he was honest with himself, it was also rather captivating. The wagon train set out promptly, with Preston riding ahead as scout. Theodora traveled with the Kinseys as promised, grateful for Martha's motherly fussing and her husband Robert's quiet kindness. Emma, refreshed after a proper feeding and clean wrappings, charmed everyone she encountered. By midday, Theodora had learned the basics about her new traveling companions. The group consisted primarily of families seeking new opportunities in Santa Fe and the surrounding territory. Some, like the Kinseys, were moving to join adult children who had already established themselves. Others were starting fresh, carrying trades and skills they hoped would be valuable in the growing town. Preston returned periodically to check on the wagon train's progress, and Theodora suspected, to check on her and Emma specifically. Each time he would stop briefly by the Kinsey's wagon, tip his hat, and ask how they were faring before continuing his scouting duties. That evening, when they made camp, Theodora helped Martha prepare supper for their section of the train. The physical activity was a welcome distraction from her thoughts, which still frequently turned to William and the life they had lost. "He seems quite taken with you," Martha commented casually as they chopped vegetables for the stew pot. "I'm sorry." Theodora looked up, confused. Martha nodded toward the edge of camp where Preston was visible talking with some of the men. "Mr. Holloway, he's checked on our wagon at least 5 times today, and it wasn't Robert or me he was looking for." Theodora felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He saved our lives yesterday." "I imagine he feels responsible for us." Martha hummed noncommittally. "He's a good man, Preston Holloway. Been scouting for wagon trains for years, according to Robert. Keeps to himself mostly, but always reliable." She paused, glancing at Theodora. "Lost his wife and child to fever some years back, I'm told." This information startled Theodora. "I didn't know." "Not surprising, he doesn't speak of it." Martha added the vegetables to the pot. "Just thought you should know he understands grief better than most." Later, after supper had been served and the camp settled into evening routines, Preston approached the small fire where Theodora sat with Emma. "May I join you?" he asked, gesturing to the log beside her. "Of course." Theodora shifted slightly to make room. "It's your fire as much as anyone's." Preston settled beside her, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "How are you finding life with the wagon train?" "Everyone has been incredibly kind," she replied honestly. "The Kinseys especially." "Martha Kinsey has a reputation for adopting strays of all sorts," Preston said with a small smile. "Human and animal alike." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the flames dance. "Martha mentioned that you lost your family," Theodora finally said, her voice gentle. "I'm sorry." Preston stiffened almost imperceptibly before his shoulders relaxed again. "It was a long time ago, 6 years this October." "Time doesn't erase it, though, does it?" she asked, thinking of her own fresh grief. "No," he agreed quietly. "It doesn't, just changes it into something you can carry." He looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in Theodora's arms. "My Sarah was about her age when the fever took her, and my wife, Rebecca." Theodora's heart ached for him. "That's why you risked the river for us." Preston's gaze met hers, surprise evident in his blue eyes. "I would have done the same for anyone in danger." "Perhaps," Theodora acknowledged, "but you understand what Emma means to me. That's why you've been so careful with us." He didn't deny it. "When I saw you in that river holding her up." He paused, seeming to search for words. "It stirred memories, and yes, I understand what it means to protect all you have left." The honest vulnerability in his voice touched something in Theodora. This man, who presented such strength and capability to the world, had experienced his own devastating loss. Yet here he was, still moving forward, still helping others. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. Preston nodded, replacing his hat as he stood. "We should reach the Narrows by tomorrow evening. The crossing there is tricky but manageable with care." He hesitated, then added, "Sleep well, Theodora. You too, Preston." As he walked away, Theodora found herself watching his retreating figure longer than was strictly necessary. There was something compelling about Preston Holloway, something beyond his undeniable competence, and the security his presence provided. She pushed the thought away. Barely a week into widowhood was no time to be noticing such things. The next day brought new challenges as the terrain grew increasingly rugged. The wagons had to navigate steep inclines and rocky passages, slowing their progress considerably. Preston was constantly in motion, riding ahead to find the best route, then returning to guide the wagons through difficult stretches. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds had begun gathering on the horizon. Preston rode up to Winslow, concern evident in his expression. "Storm's coming," he called. "We need to find shelter before it hits," Winslow nodded grimly. "Any suggestions?" "There's a protected valley about 2 miles ahead. High walls on 3 sides should block the worst of the wind." The wagon master turned to the train. "Pick up the pace, folks, we're racing the weather." The tempo of the journey immediately changed. Drivers urged their teams forward, and those walking quickly climbed aboard wagons. Theodora held Emma tightly as Robert Kinsey coaxed more speed from their oxen. They reached the valley Preston had mentioned just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Everyone worked frantically to secure the wagons and set up what shelter they could before the full force of the storm hit. Theodora handed Emma to Martha and joined the efforts, helping to unload essential supplies and secure canvas coverings. The wind picked up dramatically, whipping her hair around her face as she worked. "Get inside." Preston appeared suddenly beside her, taking the rope she was struggling to tie. "The storm's moving faster than I expected." No sooner had he spoken than the sky opened. Rain poured down in blinding sheets, and thunder cracked overhead with deafening intensity. Preston grabbed Theodora's arm, pulling her toward the nearest wagon as the deluge instantly soaked them both. Inside the Kinsey's wagon, Martha had created a cozy haven. Lanterns glowed softly, casting warm light on the cramped but orderly space. Emma lay swaddled on a small pallet, watching the shadows with wide eyes. "Goodness, you're drenched," Martha exclaimed, quickly finding a blanket for Theodora. "Where's Robert?" "Helping secure the livestock with the other men," Theodora explained, gratefully accepting the dry covering. Preston stood awkwardly at the wagon entrance, rain dripping from his hat brim. "I should go help." "Nonsense," Martha interrupted firmly. "You're as wet as a drowned rat. Come in and dry off before you catch your death." The small woman's authoritative tone brooked no argument. With a somewhat sheepish expression, Preston ducked fully into the wagon, removing his dripping hat. The storm raged outside, wind buffeting the canvas covering and rain drumming against it in rhythmic waves. Inside, however, a strange domestic tableau formed. Martha bustled about, producing coffee from seemingly nowhere and insisting everyone change into dry clothing. Robert returned shortly, equally soaked, and the wagon became even more crowded as he too was subjected to his wife's ministrations. "Like raising children all over again," Martha muttered good-naturedly as she hung wet garments from every available hook and corner. Despite the close quarters and the howling storm outside, Theodora felt an unexpected sense of contentment. Emma was safe and dry, surrounded by people who had opened their hearts to 2 strangers in need. Even Preston seemed to relax slightly, his usual vigilance softening as he sat cross-legged on the wagon floor, cradling a tin cup of coffee. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. The Kinsey's wagon, designed for a couple rather than 4 adults and an infant, required creative sleeping arrangements. Robert and Martha took their usual spot at the front, while Preston insisted on making do with a narrow space near the tailgate. "I've slept in far worse conditions," he assured them when Theodora expressed concern about his comfort. Despite his assurances, Theodora doubted anyone got much rest that night. The storm continued to pound the camp, and the close quarters made every movement noticeable. Several times she caught Preston's gaze in the dim light, a silent acknowledgement passing between them of their shared predicament. By morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving a sodden landscape in its wake. The wagon train had weathered the night without major damage, though several canvas covers had torn and one wagon had shifted precariously close to a newly formed mudslide. Outside, the world smelled fresh and new. Puddles reflected the clearing sky, and birds had begun to sing again. But the beautiful scene brought practical problems. "The ground's too soft for the wagons," Winslow announced after a brief survey. We'll need to wait at least a day for it to dry enough to travel safely." This news was met with mixed reactions. Some welcomed the rest, while others fretted about the delay. Theodora found herself oddly relieved. The unexpected day would give her time to properly launder Emma's few garments and perhaps help repay the Kinseys' kindness with assistance around camp. As the morning progressed, Theodora joined several women who had organized a communal laundry by a small stream. The physical labor of washing was soothing, and the women's conversation, carefully steered away from painful topics, provided welcome distraction. From this vantage point, she could occasionally spot Preston as he moved around the camp. Despite the forced halt, he seemed unwilling to rest, checking the wagons, helping repair storm damage, and finally riding out briefly to scout the path ahead. When he returned mid-afternoon, she noticed him speaking intently with Winslow and several other men. Their serious expressions sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with her damp clothing. She made her way back to the Kinseys' wagon, where Martha was tending to Emma. "Is something wrong?" Martha asked, noticing her troubled expression. Before Theodora could answer, Preston approached them, his face grim. "Mrs. Norton, could I speak with you privately?" The formality in his address told her everything she needed to know. "They've found us, haven't they?" Preston glanced at Martha, then nodded. "I spotted 3 riders following our trail. From your description, it's the Simmons brothers." Fear, which had receded somewhat during the past 2 days of relative safety, rushed back with paralyzing force. "How far?" "A few hours at most." "The storm slowed them, same as us." Preston's voice softened. "You should know the men have taken a vote. They'll stand with you." Tears pricked at Theodora's eyes. "I never meant to bring trouble to these good people." Martha laid a hand on her arm. "Nonsense, dear. Those ruffians would likely have caused trouble regardless. Men like that always do." Preston nodded agreement. "Winslow's organizing a watch. We'll be ready if they come." Theodora took a deep breath, steeling herself. "What can I do?" "Stay close to camp. Keep Emma with you at all times." Preston hesitated, then added, "And know that I won't let them hurt either of you." The quiet certainty in his voice calmed her somewhat. She nodded, grateful for his steady presence. As the afternoon waned into evening, a tense alertness settled over the camp. Men checked weapons, women gathered children close, and conversations were conducted in hushed tones. Preston and several others took positions at the valley's entrance, keeping watch while maintaining a casual appearance. Theodora sat with Emma near the central campfire, unable to focus on the mending Martha had given her to occupy her hands. Every unusual sound made her start, and she found herself constantly scanning the perimeter of the camp. "They may not come tonight," Robert Kinsey said gently, noting her anxiety. "Might be just following to see where you're headed." Theodora wished she could believe that, but she knew the Simmons brothers too well. They were not men who left loose ends. William had been proof of that. As darkness fell completely, the watch was rotated. Preston returned to the fire briefly to warm himself and drink a cup of coffee before his next shift. "Any sign?" Theodora asked quietly. Preston shook his head. "Nothing yet." He studied her face in the firelight. "You should try to get some rest. Martha said you're welcome in the wagon." "I couldn't sleep anyway," she admitted. Preston seemed to understand. He sat beside her, his presence somehow both comforting and energizing. They didn't speak much, but the shared vigil created its own kind of intimacy. When his turn came to return to watch, Preston stood reluctantly. "If anything happens, anything at all, you head straight for the center wagon. The women and children will gather there if there's trouble." Theodora nodded, watching as he walked back into the darkness. Around her, the camp gradually quieted as most retired to their wagons, leaving only the watch and a few others awake. She must have dozed despite her anxiety, for she woke with a start to the sound of raised voices. Dawn was just breaking, casting long shadows across the camp as she scrambled to her feet, clutching Emma, who had been sleeping beside her wrapped in blankets. At the valley entrance, a confrontation was underway. 3 mounted men faced the wagon train's defenders, who had formed a loose line across the opening. Preston stood at the center, his stance relaxed but his right hand resting near his holstered pistol. Theodora recognized the riders immediately. Silas Simmons, the eldest, sat on a big black horse, his weathered face set in lines of cruel determination. Flanking him were his brothers, Jeb and Caleb, equally hard-featured and menacing. Heart-pounding, she retreated toward the center wagon as instructed, but remained close enough to hear the exchange. "We've got no quarrel with your wagon train," Silas was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "Just looking for a woman and her brat." "Dark-haired woman, baby about 6 months old. Seen anyone matching that description?" "Plenty of women and children in these parts," Winslow replied neutrally. "What's your business with this particular one?" Silas's expression darkened. "She's wanted for murder. Killed her husband and stole valuable property." The brazen lie stunned Theodora, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Of course they would twist the truth to serve their purposes. "Serious accusation," Preston commented, his tone deceptively casual. "You lawmen then," Jeb Simmons snorted. "Law takes too long. We represent the interested parties." "I see." Preston shifted slightly. "Well, I don't recall anyone fitting that description passing through. Perhaps you should try north toward Trinidad." Silas's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Funny, their trail led right to this valley before the rain washed it away." "Rain washes away a lot of things," Preston replied evenly. "Including welcome. I suggest you gentlemen continue your search elsewhere." The tension was palpable as Silas assessed the situation. Though the Simmons brothers were armed, they were clearly outnumbered by the wagon train's defenders. After a long moment, Silas spat on the ground. "We'll be moving on, for now." His gaze swept the camp, lingering on the wagons as if trying to peer inside them. "But if we find you've been harboring a murderer, there'll be consequences." With that thinly veiled threat, the three turned their horses and rode away. No one in the camp moved until the riders had disappeared from sight. Theodora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Emma, sensing her mother's tension, began to fuss quietly. Preston and Winslow conferred briefly before Preston strode toward her, his expression grave. "They're gone for now, but I don't trust they've given up," he said quietly. Winslow's agreed we should move out immediately, despite the muddy conditions. "The Narrows aren't far, and once we cross the river, we'll have put a significant obstacle between us and them." Theodora nodded, guilt washing over her. "This is all because of me." "Everyone's in danger because I brought my troubles to your door." Preston's expression softened. "This isn't your fault, Theodora. Men like the Simmons brothers create their own trouble. And truthfully, traveling parties face threats all the time out here. It's why we band together." He managed a small smile. "Besides, I'm starting to think finding you and Emma in that river might have been the best thing that's happened to me in a long while." The unexpected admission caught her off guard. Before she could formulate a response, Preston continued, his tone shifting back to practicality. "We'll be moving in 30 minutes. I'll help the Kinseys prepare their wagon." As he walked away, Theodora found herself pondering his words. Despite the danger and uncertainty that still surrounded them, a small warmth kindled in her chest, a feeling she had thought buried with William. The wagon train moved out slowly, struggling through muddy terrain. Progress was painfully slow as wheels repeatedly became mired in the softened earth, requiring teams of men to help extract them. By midday, they had covered less than half the distance they normally would have. Preston rode constantly between the front and rear of the train, vigilant for any sign of pursuit. Each time he passed the Kinsey's wagon, he would offer a reassuring nod to Theodora, who found herself watching for his appearances with increasing anticipation. Late in the afternoon, a shout from the lead wagon announced they had reached the Narrows. Theodora peered ahead eagerly. The river here was considerably less intimidating than where she had attempted to cross, perhaps 50 feet across instead of over 100, with a more gradual bank on either side. Still, the water ran swift and deep, its surface choppy with small whitecaps. Crossing would not be simple, especially for heavily laden wagons. "We'll camp here tonight," Winslow announced. "Start crossing at first light tomorrow when we're all fresh." As the wagons circled for the night, security was noticeably tighter than usual. Extra men were assigned to watch, and families were instructed to remain close to camp. The Simmons brothers might have withdrawn, but no one believed they had abandoned their pursuit entirely. After helping prepare the evening meal, Theodora found a quiet moment to approach Preston, who was checking his horse near the edge of camp. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply, "for everything you've done for Emma and me." Preston looked up, seeming almost embarrassed by her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Theodora shook her head firmly. "Not anyone would have pulled strangers from a raging river. Not anyone would have offered shelter, protection, and kindness without question." She met his gaze directly. "You're a good man, Preston Holloway." A faint color touched his tan cheeks. "I've just done what needed doing." He turned his attention back to adjusting Buck's saddle, then added more quietly, "Though I admit it's been meaningful having you and Emma around." The admission hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to examine its implications fully. "Will you continue with the wagon train after Santa Fe?" Theodora asked, changing to safer conversational ground. Preston shook his head. "This is my last journey for a while. I've saved enough to make a proper start on my own place." A small smile touched his lips. "Bought land outside Santa Fe last year, nothing fancy but good water and decent grazing. Been building a cabin when I'm not on the trail." "Your own ranch," Theodora couldn't hide her surprise. Somehow she had assumed Preston was committed to the nomadic scout's life. "On a small scale," he clarified. "Just enough for one man to manage, or at least that was the plan." Something in his tone made Theodora wonder if his plans had begun to shift. Before she could pursue the thought, Martha called her name, needing help with Emma. "I should go," she said reluctantly. Preston nodded. "We both should rest. Tomorrow will be challenging." As Theodora walked away, she felt his gaze following her. The sensation was not unpleasant. Dawn broke clear and cool the next morning. The camp stirred early, everyone aware of the difficult task ahead. Crossing the river would require precision, teamwork, and no small amount of luck. Winslow gathered everyone for final instructions. "We'll send riders across first to secure ropes on both sides. Then wagons will cross one at a time. Lighten your loads as much as possible. Anything that can be carried separately should be. Women and children will cross on horseback with our strongest riders." The preparations began immediately. Men waded into the river, testing depths and securing guide ropes. Wagon contents were redistributed, with essential items moved to higher positions within the wagons and non-essentials carried across separately. Preston approached the Kinsey's wagon, where Theodora was helping Martha bundle their belongings. "I'll take you and Emma across personally," he told Theodora. "Buck's steady in water, and I know this crossing well." The confidence in his voice reassured her, though the memory of her previous river experience still sent shivers down her spine. "Will it be safe for Emma?" she asked, glancing at her daughter, who was contentedly playing with a wooden spoon in Robert's watchful care. "I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't believe so," Preston replied seriously. "I'll have her secured between us. If anything happens, which it won't, my first priority will be keeping her above water." Theodora nodded, trusting his judgment despite her fears. The first wagon crossed successfully around mid-morning, though not without difficulty. The team struggled against the current, and at one point the wagon tilted alarmingly before righting itself. Each subsequent crossing went more smoothly as the men refined their technique. By early afternoon, it was the Kinsey's turn. Robert would drive the wagon while Martha crossed on horseback with one of the younger men. Preston appeared with Buck, ready to take Theodora and Emma. "We'll go after the wagon is safely across," he explained, helping her fashion a secure sling for Emma from a length of fabric. The arrangement would keep the baby strapped to Theodora's chest, leaving her hands free to hold onto Preston. They watched as Robert skillfully guided the wagon into the water. The oxen moved steadily, seemingly unbothered by the rushing current. Martha had already crossed safely and waited anxiously on the far bank. "Ready?" Preston asked as the wagon reached the midpoint. Theodora took a deep breath and nodded. Emma, securely bundled against her chest, made a small sound of curiosity, Preston helped her mount, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, creating a secure enclosure for both her and Emma. "Just lean back against me and keep your feet in the stirrups," he instructed as they approached the water's edge. "Buck knows what to do." The horse entered the river confidently, his powerful legs pushing against the current. Cold water swirled around their legs, but Buck maintained his footing admirably. Theodora tried to focus on the opposite bank rather than the rushing water beneath them. Preston kept up a steady stream of quiet encouragement, both for the horse and for her. His solid presence at her back was immensely comforting, his arms steady around her as he guided Buck through the deepest part of the crossing. They were nearly 2/3 across when a shout from the bank behind them caught their attention. Preston turned in the saddle, his body tensing immediately. "Riders coming fast," he said tersely. "At least two." Theodora didn't need to ask who it was. The Simmons brothers had found them. "Can we make it across before they reach the river?" she asked, her heart pounding. "We'll have to." Preston urged Buck forward with more urgency. The horse responded admirably, pushing harder against the current. Behind them, more shouts indicated the camp had spotted the approaching threat. Men rushed to defensive positions, but they were divided by the river now, their strength split. Buck lunged forward into shallower water, his footing becoming more secure as they neared the eastern bank. Just as they reached the edge, the sound of gunfire cracked through the air. "Down." Preston commanded, practically lifting Theodora from the saddle as soon as Buck scrambled onto solid ground. He pulled them behind the bank's slight incline as more shots rang out. From their position, Theodora could see the Simmons brothers had reached the western bank. Silas and Jeb had dismounted and were firing toward the eastern side, while Caleb seemed to be circling south, perhaps looking for another crossing point. The wagon train men returned fire, forcing the brothers to take cover. For the moment, the river provided an effective barrier, but Theodora knew it wouldn't last. The Simmons were notorious for their persistence. "We need to move further from the bank," Preston said urgently. "Can you run?" Theodora nodded, adjusting Emma's sling to better secure her for quick movement. The baby, remarkably, remained quiet, perhaps sensing the tension in her mother's body. "Stay low. Head for that cluster of wagons." Preston pointed to where several vehicles had formed a protective semicircle about 50 yards from the river. "I'll be right behind you." Taking a deep breath, Theodora darted forward, keeping her body hunched to present as small a target as possible. Emma bounced against her chest as she ran, but the sling held secure. Behind her, she could hear Preston's boots on the sandy ground. They reached the wagon perimeter safely, where Martha immediately pulled Theodora into the shelter of the nearest vehicle. "Thank the Lord you're safe," the older woman exclaimed, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine fear. "Those devils started shooting without warning." Preston had already joined the men at the defensive line. Through gaps between wagons, Theodora could see him conferring with Winslow and several others, gesturing toward the river and the surrounding terrain. The gunfire had reduced to occasional shots warning fire rather than serious attempts to hit targets. It was a standoff for now, but Theodora knew the Simmons wouldn't be deterred for long. "They're after me," she told Martha, her voice tight with guilt. "All this danger because of me." Martha squeezed her hand firmly. "Don't you take that on yourself. Those men made their choices." She peered at Emma, who had begun to fuss slightly. "Let's get this little one somewhere quieter." They retreated to the Kinsey's wagon, now positioned toward the rear of the camp. Robert joined them briefly to ensure they were settled before returning to help with the defense. "Preston says they'll likely try to cross at dusk," he reported. "Harder to see them in the fading light. The men are preparing accordingly." Hours passed in tense waiting. Theodora tried to focus on caring for Emma, but her thoughts kept returning to the danger she had brought upon these good people. And to Preston, who had put himself at risk repeatedly for her sake. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Preston himself appeared at the wagon. "May I come in?" he asked, his expression serious. Martha nodded, making space for him in the cramped interior. Theodora immediately noted the gun belt strapped to his waist and the rifle in his hand. "We expect them to make their move soon," he said without preamble. "Caleb's disappeared, likely circling to cross downstream and come at us from behind." "What's the plan?" Theodora asked, unconsciously holding Emma closer. "Most of the men will maintain the river defense. A smaller group will watch our rear." Preston hesitated, then continued. "But I'm concerned about your safety specifically. If they breach our line, they'll head straight for you." The implication was clear. Despite the wagon train's best efforts, the Simmons might still reach her. "What do you suggest?" she asked, striving to keep her voice steady. "There's a small ravine about a quarter-mile east of here, defensible with good visibility in all directions." Preston met her gaze directly. "I think you, Emma, and I should slip away now before the fighting starts. I can better protect you away from the chaos of a larger battle." Martha looked alarmed. "Surely she's safer here with numbers on our side." Preston shook his head grimly. "Numbers won't matter if they're focused on the wrong direction, and in a firefight, bullets don't discriminate between targets." His expression softened as he looked at Emma. "I can't risk her getting caught in the crossfire." Theodora understood the logic, though the prospect of leaving the relative security of the wagon train frightened her. Still, she trusted Preston's judgment. "When do we leave?" she asked simply. Relief flashed briefly across Preston's features. "Now, while there's still enough light to travel safely but enough shadow for cover." He turned to Martha. "Can you create a diversion on the western side of camp, something to draw attention away from our departure?" The older woman nodded resolutely. "Robert and I will manage something suitable." Within minutes they had prepared. Theodora secured Emma in the sling once more, and Preston provided her with a small revolver. "Only as a last resort," he said as he showed her how to use it. "Stay behind me if there's trouble." Martha hugged Theodora fiercely. "God go with you, dear. We'll find you when this is over." On the western edge of camp, Robert Kinsey created the promised diversion, a controlled fire in an empty wagon that had been damaged beyond repair during the crossing. As men rushed to contain the blaze and attention focused westward, Preston led Theodora quietly eastward, staying low and using the growing shadows for concealment. Buck followed obediently, his reins in Preston's hand. They had decided against riding immediately. A mounted figure would be too easily spotted. Instead, they moved on foot until they were well clear of the camp. The distant sound of renewed gunfire told them the Simmons had likely made their move. Preston increased their pace, heading toward a line of low hills that concealed the ravine he had mentioned. "Almost there," he encouraged as Theodora struggled to keep up, the weight of Emma and the difficult terrain taking their toll. "Just over this rise." They crested the hill just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared. Below them lay a narrow ravine, perhaps 20 feet deep with steep sides and a flat bottom wide enough for a small camp. A trickle of water ran along one edge, likely runoff from recent rains. Preston helped Theodora descend the rocky slope, then led Buck down a game trail that offered easier footing. Once at the bottom, he quickly established a minimal camp, spreading a bedroll in a protected alcove and gathering a small amount of brush for a fire if needed. "We won't light it unless necessary," he explained. "Better to remain invisible." Theodora settled on the bedroll, adjusting Emma, who had remarkably slept through most of their flight. The baby stirred now, making hungry sounds that indicated her patience was wearing thin. "Go ahead and feed her," Preston said, turning away to give them privacy. "I'll keep watch from the ravine entrance." As Theodora nursed Emma, she watched Preston's silhouette against the darkening sky. His rifle rested easily across his knees as he sat on a boulder overlooking the approach to their hiding place. There was something profoundly reassuring about his vigilance. When Emma finished feeding and drifted back to sleep, Theodora carefully laid her on a soft portion of the bedroll. She then joined Preston at his lookout position, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the growing chill. "Any sign of pursuit?" she asked quietly. Preston shook his head. "Nothing yet. The gunfires stopped, which could mean several things." "None of them particularly good," Theodora surmised. "Not necessarily." Preston shifted slightly to face her. It could mean our friends drove them off, or that the Simmons realized we're not in camp and withdrew to regroup. They sat in silence for a while, the darkness deepening around them. Stars appeared overhead, brilliant pinpoints in the clear night sky. In other circumstances, it might have been a beautiful, peaceful night. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, Theodora finally spoke. About finding Emma and me being the best thing that's happened to you in a long time. Even in the dim light, she could see Preston's posture change, a slight stiffening of his shoulders, a tilt of his head. I meant it, he said simply. Though perhaps the timing wasn't ideal for such a confession, Theodora smiled softly. Is there ever an ideal time out here? Life on the frontier doesn't seem to allow for perfect moments. Preston chuckled quietly. True enough. He hesitated, then continued more seriously. After I lost Rebecca and Sarah, I thought that part of my life was over. I threw myself into work scouting, driving cattle, whatever would keep me moving and too tired to think. His voice grew softer. For years, I was just existing, not living, not really. Theodora understood completely. Though her grief was fresher, she recognized the numbness. He described the mechanical process of continuing when joy seemed permanently extinguished. What changed? She asked. Honestly, seeing you in that river. Preston turned to face her fully now. The courage it took to try that crossing alone with your child. It reminded me that life goes on, that brave people find ways to continue to hope. He reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and took her hand. You woke something in me I thought was dead, Theodora. The simple touch of his hand around her sent warmth spreading through her body. Part of her felt she should pull away, that accepting such feelings dishonored William's memory. Yet a deeper wisdom recognized that her heart's capacity for love hadn't died with her husband. I don't know what the future holds, she said honestly. Everything I planned, everything I expected from life has changed so completely. Preston nodded, understanding. I'm not asking for promises, just possibility, Theodora repeated softly. I think I can offer that. A sound from outside the ravine instantly transformed the moment. Preston was on his feet in seconds, rifle ready as he scanned the darkness. Stay with Emma, he whispered urgently. Keep out of sight. Theodora retreated to the alcove where her daughter still slept peacefully. She extracted the revolver Preston had given her, holding it nervously as she strained to hear whatever had alerted him. For several long minutes, only silence surrounded them. Then came the unmistakable sound of loose rocks tumbling down a slope. Someone was approaching the ravine. Preston had positioned himself behind a large boulder near the entrance, nearly invisible in the darkness. From her hidden position, Theodora could just make out his silhouette as he waited, perfectly still. More sounds came: the crunch of boots on gravel, the soft nickering of a horse. Then a voice called out, Holloway, I know you're down there. Got the woman with you too, I expect. Silas Simmons. The cold voice sent shivers down Theodora's spine. Preston remained silent, not revealing his position. No need to make this difficult, Silas continued. All we want is the woman and what she stole. You can ride away free and clear. When Preston finally spoke, his voice was calm and controlled. She stole nothing, Simmons. You murdered her husband and burned her home. The only thieves here are you and your brothers. A harsh laugh echoed through the ravine. That property was rightfully ours. Norton was the thief stealing water that belonged to everyone. Water rights came with his deed, Preston replied. Legal and proper. Law's one thing, justice another. Silas's voice had moved, indicating he was circling, looking for a way down into the ravine. Last chance, Holloway. Send out the woman or we're coming in shooting. We, Preston called. I only hear one voice, Simmons. Where are your brothers? A moment of silence followed, then Silas spoke again, anger evident in his tone. Your wagon train friends got lucky. Jeb took a bullet in the shoulder. Caleb's tending him. This news brought a small measure of relief to Theodora. At least they faced only one opponent now, not three. So it's just you, Preston confirmed. Against two of us on ground we control. Those aren't good odds, Simmons. The woman's no threat, Silas scoffed. And I've heard about you, Holloway. Scout, not gunfighter. You really want to die for a woman you barely know. Preston's reply was immediate and firm. If necessary, yes. The simple declaration hung in the night air. Theodora felt tears spring to her eyes at the quiet commitment behind those words. Silas's response was a gunshot that pinged off the boulder near Preston's position. Preston returned fire immediately, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the ravine from her protected position. Theodora couldn't see what was happening clearly. More shots were exchanged, then came the sound of sliding rocks and a grunt of effort. Silas was descending into the ravine. Preston fired again, then quickly changed position, moving to another boulder several yards away. The strategy worked. Silas's next shot hit where Preston had been moments before. "You can't hide forever," Silas called, his voice closer now, "and I've got all night." The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Occasionally one man would fire, forcing the other to stay in cover. Theodora cradled Emma, who had awakened at the gunfire, and whimpered softly. "SHH, sweet girl," she whispered, stroking her daughter's cheek. "Everything will be all right." A sudden flurry of movement and gunfire erupted near the ravine entrance. Preston had apparently decided to force the issue, moving aggressively towards Silas's position. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, followed by a cry of pain. Theodora's heart froze. Whose voice had that been? Silence fell, broken only by the sound of labored breathing. Then footsteps moving slowly toward her hiding place. She raised the revolver with trembling hands, prepared to defend Emma with her last breath. "Theodora," Preston's voice strained but unmistakable. "It's over." She lowered the gun, relief flooding through her as Preston appeared at the entrance to the alcove. He was clutching his left arm, blood seeping between his fingers, but he was upright and alert. "You're hurt," she exclaimed, carefully laying Emma down to examine his wound. "Just a graze," he assured her, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed the pain he felt. "Silas wasn't so lucky." Theodora glanced toward the ravine entrance. "Is he?" "Dead," Preston confirmed grimly. "He left no choice." Using strips torn from a spare shirt, Theodora bandaged Preston's arm as best she could. The wound was indeed relatively minor, a deep furrow across his upper arm that bled profusely but hadn't hit anything vital. "What now?" she asked as she tied off the bandage. "We should return to the wagon train at first light," Preston replied, settling beside her with a wince. "Safer to travel in daylight, and they need to know what happened here." Theodora nodded agreement. "And after that, when we reach Santa Fe." The question contained layers of meaning that both understood. Preston took her hand gently in his uninjured one. "That depends on what you want, Theodora." His voice was soft but earnest. "I meant what I said earlier. Meeting you and Emma has changed everything for me." Theodora looked at her sleeping daughter, then back at Preston. "William will always be part of me," she said carefully. "Part of Emma too, but I've learned that life doesn't end with loss. It changes, becomes something new." Preston nodded understanding. "I would never ask you to forget him." "I know." Theodora squeezed his hand. That's why I think there could be a future for us if you want that." The smile that spread across Preston's face was like sunrise after the darkest night. "I want that more than anything." They sat together in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, returning to the wagon train, continuing to Santa Fe, building a life together. But for now, in this moment of hard-won peace, possibility had transformed into promise. Morning arrived with gentle light filtering into the ravine. Theodora awoke to find Preston already up, tending to Buck and keeping watch. Emma stirred beside her, making the small sounds that indicated hunger was imminent. As she fed her daughter, Theodora observed Preston moving about their small camp. Despite his injured arm, he worked efficiently, preparing for their departure. There was something different about him this morning, a lightness in his movements, an occasional small smile that appeared for no apparent reason. She recognized it because she felt it too, the buoyant sensation of hope renewed. "Ready to head back?" Preston asked, approaching as she finished with Emma. Theodora nodded. "Do you think everyone at the wagon train is all right?" "I believe so." Simmons indicated the others retreated after Jeb was wounded. Preston offered his hand to help her up. "They're capable people." Winslow would have ensured everyone's safety. The climb out of the ravine was challenging, especially for Theodora carrying Emma, but Preston found an easier path than their descent had taken. Once on level ground, he helped her mount Buck, then swung up behind her as he had during the river crossing. This time, however, there was a new awareness between them as his arms encircled her to take the reins. The simple contact felt both protective and promising. They rode at an easy pace, mindful of Preston's injury and the precious cargo Theodora held. The morning was beautiful clear skies, meadowlarks singing, wildflowers dotting the landscape. It seemed impossible that just hours ago they had been fighting for their lives. There, Preston pointed as they crested a rise. Below them, the wagon train was visible, arranged in its usual circular formation. People moved about the camp and smoke rose from cooking fires. Everything appeared normal, which was the greatest relief of all. They were spotted as they approached. Several men rode out to meet them, rifles ready until they recognized Preston. Robert Kinsey was among them, his weathered face breaking into a smile of genuine relief. "Thought we might have lost you," he called as they drew near. Martha's been beside herself with worry. "We had a visitor," Preston replied grimly. "Silas Simmons found us." Robert's expression sobered immediately, and he won't be troubling anyone again. The simple statement required no elaboration. Robert nodded understanding, then turned his horse to lead them back to camp. Martha rushed to meet them as they rode in, her usual composure abandoned as she reached for Emma the moment Theodora dismounted. "Let me look at this precious girl," she exclaimed, checking the baby as if expecting to find injury. Finding Emma perfectly content, she turned her attention to Theodora and Preston. Her sharp eyes immediately noticed the blood-stained bandage on Preston's arm. "Inside the wagon, both of you," she ordered. "That needs proper tending, and you both need food and rest." No one argued with Martha when she used that tone. Soon they were settled in the wagon while she cleaned and re-bandaged Preston's wound, clicking her tongue in disapproval though acknowledging Theodora's field dressing had been well done. Winslow joined them as Martha worked, wanting a full account of what had transpired. Preston related the events concisely, including the confirmation that Jeb Simmons had been wounded and he and Caleb had withdrawn. "We had our own excitement," Winslow reported. "Caleb tried to circle behind us as you predicted, but our rear guard spotted him, took a bullet in the leg for his trouble. He and Jeb pulled out before full dark, heading west." "They might return," Preston cautioned. Winslow shook his head. "Not likely. Without Silas, those two don't have the spine for a direct confrontation. Besides, we're moving out today, continuing to Santa Fe." He glanced at Theodora. "Unless you need more rest, madam." "No," she replied firmly. "I'm ready to move forward." The double meaning in her words wasn't lost on Preston, whose eyes met hers with quiet understanding. The wagon train departed within the hour, leaving behind the river that had played such a pivotal role in Theodora's fate. The crossing that had nearly claimed her and Emma's lives had ultimately led them to safety and to Preston. Over the following days, as they traveled the final stretch to Santa Fe, a new rhythm developed. Preston still performed his scouting duties but returned to the Kinsey's wagon whenever possible. In the evenings, he would often sit with Theodora near the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying a companionable silence as Emma slept nearby. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. Martha made no direct comment, but often found reasons to give them privacy. Others in the wagon train observed with approving smiles how naturally Preston had assumed a protective role toward both Theodora and Emma. For her part, Theodora found herself increasingly drawn to Preston's steady presence. His gentle way with Emma, his quiet strength, and his respect for her independence all spoke to qualities she valued deeply. The guilt she had initially felt that growing feelings for another man somehow dishonored William's memory gradually faded as she recognized that her heart had room for both the love she had lost and the love that was tentatively taking root. One evening, as they sat slightly apart from the main camp watching the sunset, Preston spoke of his plans more specifically. "My property is about 5 miles outside Santa Fe," he explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt with a stick. It's not large, 80 acres, but it has good water and decent soil. The cabin needs work, but it's solid. Theodora listened, noting the pride in his voice as he described the land he had chosen. I've planted some fruit trees already, he continued. They're just saplings now, but in a few years. He trailed off, perhaps realizing how much he was revealing about his hopes for the future. It sounds wonderful, Theodora said sincerely. A good place to build a life. Preston looked at her directly. That's what I've been thinking. He took a breath, seeming to gather his courage. Theodora, I know it's too soon, perhaps, but I want you to know that when we reach Santa Fe, you and Emma would be welcome to stay. Not just temporarily, but permanently. Though she had anticipated something of this nature, hearing the actual invitation made Theodora's heart beat faster. Are you asking? She began. Not marriage, not yet, Preston clarified quickly. That would be presumptuous. But I am asking if you might consider a future that includes me, if you might give us time to see if what's growing between us could become something lasting. The honesty and respect inherent in his proposal touched Theodora deeply. He wasn't rushing her or making assumptions, simply offering a possibility. I would like that, she replied softly. Very much. The smile that transformed Preston's face made him look years younger. Almost tentatively, he reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. We'll take it one day at a time, he promised. No pressure, no expectations beyond what feels right to you. Theodora squeezed his hand in silent gratitude for his understanding. Ahead of them lay uncertainty how her sister would receive her, how Emma would adjust to a new environment, how her own heart would heal and open. But for the first time since William's death, the future held promise rather than just survival. 2 days later, the spires of Santa Fe's San Miguel Chapel came into view. The wagon train had reached its destination after weeks of difficult travel. A ripple of excitement passed through the group as people pointed out landmarks and children bounced with anticipation. For Theodora, the sight brought mixed emotions. Relief at reaching safety warred with anxiety about what awaited her. Would her sister Catherine welcome them with open arms as promised in her letters? Would she approve of Theodora's developing relationship with Preston? As if sensing her thoughts, Preston rode up beside the wagon. Your sister's place is on San Francisco Street, correct? I can take you there directly if you'd like. Theodora nodded gratefully. Thank you, though I should say proper goodbyes to the Kinseys and others first. Of course, Preston agreed. The train will make camp at the outskirts before people disperse to their various destinations. There will be time. The farewells proved more emotional than Theodora had anticipated. Martha embraced her fiercely, extracting promises of visits. Others from the train offered good wishes, many commenting on what a beautiful family she and Preston would make, assumptions neither corrected. Finally, with Emma securely in her makeshift sling and her few possessions bundled behind Preston's saddle, they set off toward the center of Santa Fe. The town was busy with activity, traders, locals, and travelers, creating a vibrant tapestry of humanity that contrasted sharply with the isolation of their journey. Catherine's home was easy to find. The blacksmith shop operated by her husband Thomas fronted the street, with their living quarters behind and above it. Smoke rose from the forge, indicating Thomas was at work. Preston helped Theodora dismount, then stood somewhat awkwardly beside Buck. Would you prefer I wait outside while you have your reunion? Theodora shook her head firmly. You've been part of our journey every step of the way. You should be part of its completion. Together they approached the shop entrance. Inside, a burly man with a thick beard was hammering at a glowing piece of metal. He looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from professional inquiry to shock as he recognized Theodora. Good Lord, Catherine, he called, setting down his hammer. Catherine, come quickly. A slender woman with dark hair like Theodora's rushed in from a side door. She froze at the sight of her sister, then let out a cry of joy and crossed the space in seconds, enveloping Theodora in a fierce embrace that carefully avoided squashing Emma between them. Theo, oh my God, Theo. Catherine pulled back to look at her sister's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Your letter said you were coming, but it arrived only yesterday. We had no idea you were so close. It's been a difficult journey, Theodora admitted, her own eyes filling with tears of relief and joy. But we made it, Catherine finally seemed to register Preston's presence in Emma's tiny form. Oh, the baby and your husband. Her voice trailed off as she noted the solemn expressions that greeted this last word. William is dead, Kath, Theodora said quietly. Murdered by men who wanted our land. This is Preston Holloway, who saved Emma and me from drowning and protected us on the journey here. Catherine's eyes widened as she absorbed this information. She turned to Preston, grasping his hand in both of hers. Then we owe you a debt we can never repay, Mr. Holloway. No debt, Preston replied simply. It's been my honor to assist them. Thomas had approached during this exchange, wiping his hands on his leather apron. You must all come inside, he insisted. Catherine has kept food warm since your letter arrived, hoping each day would bring you. The next hours passed in a blur of explanations, tears, and cautious joy. Theodora related the full story of William's death and their subsequent flight, while Catherine and Thomas listened with horror and sympathy. Preston added details about the river rescue and the confrontation with the Simmons brothers, though he modestly downplayed his own role. Throughout the conversation, Catherine watched the subtle interactions between her sister and Preston with increasingly knowing eyes. When Thomas took Preston to see a new metalworking technique he was proud of, giving the sisters a moment alone, Catherine pounced. He's in love with you, she stated without preamble. And unless I'm completely mistaken, you're not indifferent to him either. Theodora blushed despite herself. It's complicated, Kath. Love usually is, her sister replied pragmatically, but I see how he looks at you and at Emma. Like you're both precious beyond measure. She took Theodora's hand. William would want you to be happy, you know. That's what I've been telling myself, Theodora admitted, but it feels so soon. Catherine shook her head firmly. Time works differently out here. Life is too uncertain to waste it on conventions that make no sense in this territory. She glanced toward the door where the men had disappeared. He seems like a good man, Theo. The best, Theodora agreed softly. He's asked me to consider a future with him. Not marriage, not yet, he's giving me time. Respectful as well as brave, Catherine approved. I like him already. When Preston and Thomas returned, conversation shifted to practical matters. Catherine and Thomas insisted Theodora and Emma stay with them, at least initially. Preston accepted their invitation to dinner, but explained he needed to see to his own property. I've been away for months, he said. No telling what state the cabin is in. As evening approached and Preston prepared to leave, Theodora walked with him to where Buck waited patiently. Will you come tomorrow? She asked, suddenly reluctant to see him go after so many days of constant companionship. Preston nodded, his expression softening. Try and stop me. He hesitated, then asked, would you and Emma like to see the property sometime soon, when you're rested, of course? I'd like that very much, Theodora replied sincerely. Perhaps the day after tomorrow. Perfect. Preston checked Buck's cinch, then turned back to her. For a moment he seemed uncertain, then he gently took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply touching. Until tomorrow, then. Theodora watched him ride away, a curious mixture of emotions swirling within her. Part of her felt she should be grieving more, missing William more acutely. Yet another part recognized that joy and pain could coexist, that finding happiness with Preston didn't diminish what she had shared with William. The following days established a new pattern. Preston visited daily, sometimes staying for meals, sometimes simply stopping by to check on Theodora and Emma. Catherine and Thomas, seeing the obvious connection between them, tactfully gave them space while remaining supportive. Emma, for her part, seemed to blossom in the stable environment. She gained weight, attempted new sounds, and developed a particular fondness for Preston, who could often coax smiles from her that no one else could manage. 2 days after their arrival, as planned, Preston took Theodora and Emma to see his property. The ride was pleasant, with Preston pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area. When they crested a small hill and his land came into view, Theodora understood immediately why he had chosen it. A clear stream cut through gently rolling terrain, with cottonwood trees providing natural shade. The cabin sat on a slight rise, positioned to catch morning sunlight and afternoon shade. Though modest in size, it appeared solid and well-built. "It's beautiful," Theodora said honestly as they approached. Preston smiled, obvious pride in his expression. "It needs work, but it has good bones." He helped her dismount, then led her to the cabin. The previous owner started it but passed away before finishing. "I've been adding to it when I can." Inside, the cabin was simple but well-crafted. A main room with a stone fireplace, two smaller rooms off to one side, and a lean-to kitchen comprised the structure. The furnishings were minimal: a table with chairs, a bed frame without a mattress, some shelves, but the potential was evident. "I thought this could be a nursery," Preston said somewhat hesitantly, showing her the smallest room, "and this would be the main bedroom." He cleared his throat, perhaps realizing the presumption in his words. "That is, if someday, well, it would be suitable for a family, is what I mean." Theodora touched his arm gently. "It's perfect, Preston, truly." They spent the afternoon exploring the property. Preston showed her the young orchard he had planted, the vegetable garden that had gone wild in his absence but could be reclaimed, and the small barn where he hoped to keep horses and eventually some cattle. Throughout the tour, Theodora found herself envisioning a future here. She could almost see Emma playing under the cottonwood trees, chickens scratching in a yard, smoke rising from the cabin chimney on cold mornings. As they prepared to return to town, Preston seemed to reach a decision. "Theodora, I've been thinking," he began, his usual confidence somewhat diminished. "I understand if it's too soon, but would you consider marrying me?" Though not entirely unexpected, the proposal still caught Theodora by surprise. She looked at Preston, this good, honorable man who had risked his life for her and Emma, who understood loss and renewal, who offered not just security but companionship and genuine affection. "Yes," she said simply, "I would be honored to be your wife." The joy that transformed Preston's face was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. He stepped forward, hesitated briefly, then gently cupped her face in his hands. "May I?" he asked softly. At her nod, he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that was tender yet held the promise of deeper passion. It felt like coming home after a long journey, familiar yet new, safe yet exhilarating. When they parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I'll do everything in my power to make you and Emma happy," he promised. "I know," Theodora replied. "We already are." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at San Miguel Chapel. Catherine stood as Theodora's witness, with Thomas serving the same role for Preston. Emma, dressed in a new gown Catherine had sewn, observed the proceedings with wide-eyed curiosity from Martha Kinsey's arms, the older woman having insisted on traveling from her family's new homestead for the occasion. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with promises exchanged that both bride and groom intended to honor for a lifetime. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Preston's kiss was both reverent and joyful, a perfect reflection of the journey that had brought them to this moment. The small reception afterward, held at Catherine and Thomas's home, was a cheerful gathering of new friends and temporary family. The Kinseys and several others from the wagon train attended, along with neighbors and business associates of Thomas's who welcomed the newcomers warmly. As evening approached, Preston helped Theodora into the wagon he had purchased specifically for their new life together. Emma, sleepy after the day's excitement, nestled contentedly in her mother's arms. Buck and a newly acquired mare named Daisy would pull them to their home, their real home now. The ride passed in companionable conversation and occasional comfortable silence. When they crested the final hill and the cabin came into view, Theodora gasped in surprise. Lanterns hung from the porch posts and nearby trees, creating a welcoming glow in the gathering dusk. "When did you do this?" she asked, turning to Preston in wonder. He smiled, a hint of mischief in his expression. "I had some help. Thomas rode out this morning to prepare things." As they drew closer, more details became visible: a new rocking chair on the porch, curtains in the windows, smoke curling from the chimney. Preston helped her down from the wagon, then surprised her completely by sweeping her and Emma into his arms to carry them across the threshold. "Welcome home," he said simply as he set them down in the main room. The transformation inside was even more remarkable than the exterior. The previously sparse furnishings had been supplemented with comfortable additions: a proper bed with linens, a cradle for Emma, rugs on the wooden floors, and curtains that Catherine had obviously made from fabric Theodora had admired in town. "It's perfect," she breathed, turning slowly to take in the details. "Absolutely perfect." Emma, roused by the movement and new surroundings, began to fuss. Preston immediately went to the kitchen area, returning with a bottle of warm milk. "I thought she might be hungry after the long day," he explained, offering the bottle somewhat tentatively. "Catherine showed me how to prepare it." Theodora handed Emma to him, watching with a full heart as her new husband carefully cradled her daughter, offering the bottle with gentle expertise. Emma accepted both the nourishment and the provider with equal contentment. "You're a natural," Theodora observed, moving to stand beside them. Preston smiled, his gaze fixed on Emma's tiny face. "She makes it easy." He glanced up at Theodora, his expression turning more serious. "I hope you know that I consider her mine now in every way that matters, not a replacement for Sarah, but a daughter of my heart nonetheless." Tears of happiness pricked at Theodora's eyes. "I do know that, and she is fortunate beyond measure to have you as a father." Later, after Emma had been settled in her cradle and they had enjoyed a simple supper prepared in advance by Catherine, Preston and Theodora sat on the porch in the cool evening air. The stars overhead seemed particularly brilliant, as if celebrating with them. "Are you happy?" Preston asked quietly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Theodora considered the question seriously. She would always carry the grief of William's loss, always honor his memory and the love they had shared. But happiness had found her again, unexpectedly and beautifully. "Yes," she replied, squeezing his hand. "More than I thought possible just a few months ago." Preston raised their joined hands to his lips. "When I saw you in that river, I was only thinking of saving you and Emma. I had no idea I was also saving myself." Theodora leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her like the gentle breeze that rustled the cottonwood leaves. "Perhaps we saved each other." 1 year later, the summer sun bathed the small ranch in golden light as Theodora hung freshly washed clothes on the line. From the corral nearby came the sound of Preston's voice as he worked with a young colt, his tone patient and encouraging. In the shade of a large cottonwood, Emma played contentedly, her once tiny form now that of a sturdy toddler delighting in her newfound mobility. So much had changed in a year. The cabin had expanded with an additional room. The garden flourished under Theodora's care. A small herd of cattle grazed in the nearby pasture, the beginning of what Preston hoped would eventually become a profitable enterprise. Most dramatically, Theodora's figure had begun to round with the promise of new life, a baby due when the autumn leaves began to turn. Life wasn't perfect. They had weathered challenges: a harsh winter, a brief illness that had swept through the territory claiming several lives, the ongoing adjustments of building a life together. But they had faced each difficulty as partners, their bond strengthening with each obstacle overcome. Emma's excited squeal drew Theodora's attention. Preston had finished with the colt and now swung their daughter high into the air, her laughter pealing across the yard. He set her gently on his shoulders, holding her little legs securely as he walked toward Theodora. "Mama," Emma called, waving enthusiastically. Her vocabulary grew daily, a constant source of amazement and pride. "Hello, my loves," Theodora greeted them, reaching up to touch Emma's chubby hand before accepting Preston's quick kiss. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his free hand gently resting on her growing belly. "Wonderful," she answered truthfully. "Though your son or daughter has been practicing what feels like riding skills all morning." Preston's face lit with the same wonder it always showed when she referenced the coming baby. "Taking after their pa already," he joked. helping Emma down from his shoulders. As Emma toddled off to investigate a butterfly, Preston drew Theodora into a gentle embrace. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" he murmured against her hair. Not since breakfast," she teased, leaning into his solid warmth. A terrible oversight." Preston pulled back slightly to meet her gaze, his blue eyes reflecting the depth of his feelings. "I love you, Theodora Holloway, more with each passing day." Theodora raised a hand to his cheek, still marveling sometimes at the journey that had brought them together. From a desperate river crossing to this moment of domestic tranquility, a path neither could have foreseen but both now treasured. "And I love you," she replied softly, "with all my heart." Emma's return interrupted the moment, her small hands tugging at both their clothing to demand attention for her latest discovery. They turned to her together, united in love for this child who had been the catalyst for their meeting. As the day mellowed toward evening, Theodora watched her husband and daughter from the porch, one hand resting on her belly where new life grew. The river that had nearly claimed them had instead delivered them to this life, this family, this love, this future full of promise. Sometimes, she reflected, the most dangerous crossings led to the most beautiful destinations.